Real-world computer programming for kids of all ages. Step 37. Downloading and installing MySQL and Dbwb and preparing to create our first table. Now that we know the basics about databases, what they are, why they are so valuable, and the basics of how to communicate with them using SQL, we are going to create a database and then get ready to prepare to create a table in that database. MySQL. In order to play along, the first thing you need to do is install the MySQL database itself. It is free from Oracle. Then you will need to download and install a magnificent free tool called Database Workbench from Obscene. But rather than have me tell you all the steps I took to find, download, and install MySQL, I recommend that you Google, YouTube, how to install MySQL, and watch one of those videos. For example, this one, and I provide a link, has 250,000 views. Database Workbench. Now, to download and install Database Workbench, follow these steps. 1. Point your browser to, and it gives the URL for Database Workbench for Obscene.com, the company that creates Database Workbench. Do people still say that? Point your browser at? I may be showing my age there. I still remember when the internet really took hold, which was around 1990. The World Wide Web part of the internet, I mean. Other parts of it had already been around for decades, since the 1960s anyway. 2. Go to the Downloads menu and select from it Download Trial Versions. Don't worry, we are not really downloading a trial version, but a free, limited version. Not so limited that we will run into roadblocks, though. It should be plenty powerful and feature-rich for our needs. 3. Now that you're on the Downloads page, scroll down to the Database Workbench section of the page and select the free Lite Edition download link, which is DB Workbench 5 Lite MySQL.exe. And there's a picture of it in the newsletter. 4. Now that you have the installation executable downloaded, double-click it to install it. I am assuming you probably know how to download and install software, but just to be sure, you should see this after you double-click the installation file. And it shows a screenshot of what you should see at that point. The installer recommends shutting down all the other software, and to be on the safe side, I do that, except for the operating system, which is also software after all, but needs to be running, and my browser, which should be safe to keep open. 5. Once Dbwb installs, go ahead and let it run. You will see this. It shows a screenshot of that. Now we want to create a database so that we can work with one and put our newfound SQL knowledge to use. 6. Click the blue Register Server button on the upper left of that opening screen. You should then see this, and it shows another screenshot of the Register Server Wizard dialog. As you can see, you only have one option for database type with the light and free version of Dbwb. So, click the next button. You should then see the Server Registration Properties dialog, and it shows a screenshot of that dialog. Looks pretty daunting. What is all this stuff? For our purposes, it should be fairly simple because we only want a local stored on our own computer database. If we select the Help button on the lower left, it will open a Help page. 7. Scroll down to MySQL and click that link. You will see that many of these values need to be supplied. 8. Enter a name in the alias edit box. This is the alias of your database, or what it will be called. In other words, it is what you want to call it. In my case, I entered Idiolectable MySQL. 9. Leave the folder value at the default root. 10, for host name / IP address, enter 127.0.0.1. 11, port should already be set to 3306. If it is not, set it to that. 12, accept root as the username, provided you retained that username when setting up Mysql. 13, enter the password which you opted to use when you set up Mysql. And wallaby. Let the French continue to say voila, but as for me, give me wallaby or just give me wallaby. I prefer that. You will now see that your database has been created in Database Workbench, Mysql edition. We will just call it Dbwb from now on. And it shows a screenshot of that. Note how the alias we chose, in my case, idiolectable MySQL, is the name of the whole shebang, also known as the server. And there are all kinds of interesting and or perhaps a bit intimidating parts to our new database, such as a backups repository and user manager and role manager beneath the security folder. These are mainly for use in large-scale databases, so we'll leave them be for now. What we want to do at this time is create a table. There are some sample tables that are already a part of the database, namely Sequila, Sys, and World, but we will let them be two for now at least. In the Dbwb Enterprise Manager, right-click Databases and select Create New Database. This dialog will appear, and it shows a screenshot of that. 15, select the Next button. You will see this. It shows a screenshot. 16, select the Finish button. Your new database will now display. Right-click Tables and select New Table, as shown here, and that screenshot is displayed. This populates the main area of Dbwb with a set of table-related tabs. Select the DDL tab, and you will see this bit of template table creation code. And, of course, it shows a screenshot of that. You may be wondering what this DDL jazz is. DDL stands for Data Definition Language and is part of SQL. In fact, the acronym DML, Data Manipulation Language, is also bandied about with regards to SQL statements that manipulate or change data, such as the insert, update, and delete statements that we discussed in the previous step. Again, it's still SQL to me, as Billy Joel said, or something to that effect. And then it shows a picture of him, Billy Joel, with the song, Still Rock and Roll to Me. To create the states table, replace the boilerplate / template create table statement with the specific table name and column names, along with their data types that you want. As you will see, though, we will actually be doing that indirectly. Before proceeding further, though, it is best to march in place for a little while as we discuss data types and how they differ, at least slightly, between different DBMS offerings, such as MS SQL Server, Oracle, Firebird, MySQL, etc., and even more so between programming languages, such as C# and databases in general. For example, if I were to create a C# class of the table I have in mind, it would be something like this, and it shows the code for that class. Of course, this works differently in different programming languages. Even more drastic is the difference when creating a table in a DBMS. For one thing, the data types, although they have their counterparts for the most part, have different names and, to some degree, characteristics. For example, what is called a string in C# is a char or varchar in MySQL. There is no bool data type in MySQL. The basic template for the DDL required to create a table is, and it shows that, and it's just a couple lines of code. In other words, the basic shell to create a table is pretty simple and sparse, You can add as many columns as you want. You can append a not null to any of the columns as desired or needed if you want to make sure that that column always contains a value. The database will not allow a record to be inserted unless that column has been assigned an appropriate value. But to now provide a concrete example of creating a table, I will now show you the DDL, data definition language, subset or dialect of SQL, that I think will be needed to create a table that corresponds to the C# states class above, and then explain it a little. And then it shows a create table DDL that I'm expecting to be created indirectly by us or something similar to it. We'll check it later to see how close I came. As to data types, you probably recognize int and date from C# and guess that integer in MySQL is the same thing as int in C#. But instead of string, MySQL uses varchar, in. Varchar, left paren, some number, right paren. Varchar is short for variable characters. In other words, it is a string which contains a variable amount of characters, up to whatever number appears after it. So varchar, left paren 30, right paren, means the column value can contain any string up to 30 characters in length. There is also a text data type in MySQL which stores very large strings. Additionally, you will notice a blob type, B-L-O-B. A blob is not a creature from a B movie which comes sloshing up out of a black lagoon, or some rough beast slouching towards Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. B-L-O-B stands for binary large object. The first letter in binary, the first letter in large, and the first two letters in object. In other words, a blob, from a database perspective, refers to a very large bucket which will hold raw data, rather than holding data of a specific type as the other columns do. Note, normally the preferred method, images would not be stored directly in the database because they can be so large. A more typical approach is to store the images on a local server and then store just the path to those images in the database. But because our database is small, only 50 records, the images will not be huge, and it is more straightforward to do so. I am storing them directly in the database, in the blob column. As the states table above shows, you can make one of the columns, the first one, an auto-incrementing ID column by declaring it column name int, not null, auto _ increment. And you can later declare that ID value as a PK or a primary key for the table, which can in turn be used as an FK, foreign key, in another table. We'll get into those matters later when we talk about the R that is usually prepended to DBMS, that is to say RDBMS, which stands for Relational Database Management System. Note, time for another pronunciation rant. Many, if not most, programmers pronounce VARCHAR as if it rhymed with far-par. They pronounce it varchar. But since the VAR part comes from the word variable, and the CHAR part comes from the word character, it is only logical, and programmers are supposed to be logical, that it should be pronounced varchar, not varchar. We got our database set up in this step by downloading and installing the database, MySQL, and a tool to work with MySQL databases, Database Workbench, and have prepared to create a table, the states table, by determining what its structure or definition is to be. But we have not actually created the table yet. In Dbwb, we will do that indirectly, as mentioned already, by creating one column at a time using the Columns tab. By doing so, the content in the DDL tab will automatically be generated. In the next step, we will go through the process of building the create statement and then create the table using that. Until then, my friends.